Right.
I just want to welcome you all here for this evening. Pleased to introduce Bill Boller. Bill is one of the board of directors for the Portola Alpine, PB&A, Portola Valley and Alpine Mountain Railroad in the Bay Area, of California. Bill tonight is going to be talking about basically putting propane into live steam locomotives. One of the things that he's definitely going to focus on is kind of the things that you need to know and would want to know if you're going to be converting from some other type of fuel to propane. So with that, I'll turn it over to Bill, and he can go through his agenda and continue on from there. So,
thank you. Welcome. Nice to see you all here. There's some very knowledgeable people in the audience.
You want the microphone on?
I've got a mic.
That doesn't talk over.
Is it working?
That's for the recording. That's for the recording. That one's for us.
That microphone on the table, Bill.
So I got to do it.
Turn it on, flip the switch up.
I only have 2 hands.
Wait 15 seconds.
Turn it on and wait 15 seconds.
It takes a minute to warm up. There it is. You're there.
It's a heartbeat.
Yep.
So I started to say there's some a wealth of knowledge in the audience that has participated in a lot of the things that I'm going to share with you. So when we get to the question and answer period and what have you, you won't have to just rely on me lying to you. I've got other people conditioned to do that. I wanted to put up just a sort of a outline so you can keep track of where we are going to go here. I'm going to talk a little bit about how did we, and in particular, how did I get here, a background for the discussion, because it's relevant to the learnings, because I had to go through this too. It was a number of years ago when my good friend Jimmy Booth said, I'm going to do propane, and I said, what's that? And we went from that experiment to where we are today. We've come quite a ways. So that will lend a lot of the understanding as to why we've drawn the conclusions we've drawn and what we had to look at. We'll talk about the request from Train Mountain, railroaders, and others, because ever since I made the mistake of displaying some knowledge in this, the fans have never ceased to continue to ask. So I want to go through what some of the requests are that we're going to address. We'll talk about some fundamentals important for common understanding. I did that in the article originally because there's some pretty basic things at the origin of this that have been confused. If we get those straight, then it'll be easier to communicate and go into the next part, which is a little bit of a quantitative aspect. So I'm not going to get deep into the physics and math, but there is going to be some math behind this because that's critical to how this all works. Then we'll move to designing and building a solution for a particular engine, what I'd recommend if a general purpose for you. We'll then try and summarize some highlights. I've got my short list of highlights, and maybe some of the other experts in the audience can indicate their highlights that correlate to that and what have you, and then we've got just a brief demonstration to show. So we'll go through that. It's going to be mostly me talking. When we get into the quantitative aspects, there'll be a couple more charts with more detail. So to start with, I find this really intriguing. I love technical things, and this hobby, I think, is target-rich for people with inquisitive minds. And I've noticed ever since I got in it a number of years ago, the multiplicity of opportunities for improvements is sort of never-ending. So whether you want to improve the water in your engine, or the drying of the engine, or the ability to re-rail engines, or what have you, there's lots of opportunities. But I marvel because with most of those things, we put a tremendous amount of energy into looking at making so all these opportunities for improvement, and it dawned on me that we are trying, in many cases, to just redo what some very capable people did 150 years ago, and I wonder how did we got off track and we can't just take that. So sometimes don't feel so smart about it. A lot of a lot of, let's say, old wives' tales and best practices in this hobby end up having gotten off the rails, so to speak, from what was been known for many, many years. The propane thing is a little different. You know, propane allows additional opportunity, but there's not a lot of full-size propane locomotives running around, and there never was a lot of effort put to running an engine on propane. And so this gives us not a legacy to look back on and contrast with, but in fact, we have to pioneer some original work here, because most of the devices that are designed for using propane is used for things that are quite different than what we do. And as a result, a lot of the devices that you can get and use are not directly suited for this. If you wanted to design a propane-fired full-size locomotive, you would not do it the way we do ours, nor even a version of that. It would be a totally separate, different kind of an approach. I won't get into that. But just suffice it to say, we have an opportunity here to learn a lot. The common denominator is there's a lot of myths that are just plain wrong. As Reagan said, it isn't that people don't know things, that they know so much that isn't true. And that's what I've found in going through this in detail. So how did this all sort of start? The use of propane in the engines has been controversial and not well respected for many years, but the technology isn't. So when you find that things work or don't work, you run into a lot of opinions that are invalid as to why they don't. The math and the physics are pretty clear if you want to look at it. So you can have controversy over whether you want to use propane or not, but you can't really make arguments as to why without coming back to some basics, and that's one of the things we're going to try and do tonight. My involvement personally goes back a number of years here. I was sitting at Melita's one night having dinner with some Train Mountain friends, and there was a person here, a very bigger than life person at the time. He was fairly new here at the time. He had a bigger than life engine here, and he had a person who made the engine for him who was very, very well respected by me and others in this hobby. Been in it for a long time, made some very nice big engines, and in fact he used the castings and the plans from another guy who's been in the hobby for many years, who deserves all of our admiration for his contributions as well. And other people who've made the large engines that I have great admiration for. They've done things that I'd never be able to do in this hobby. But they all seem to have come to a common conclusion that big engines cannot be run on propane. So that was a pretty well-known fact back 20 years ago. You can't run big engines on propane. And after going through all this, I think I now see exactly how that happened. And by the end of the presentation, I think you can see how logically people could draw that conclusion. My point is that among the people that I respect at the highest points in this hobby have all come to, a great number of them came to a common denominator conclusion that you couldn't run big engines on propane. And that created its own sort of background, which precluded then from getting through and finding out can you or not. Because boy, if those guys can't, they build engines that I can't build, then I can't. And so they accepted it. So this particular night, I'm having dinner in Melita's, and this discussion came up, and these guys that we all respect said it couldn't be done, and so they came over, and a couple of guys there, respect my technical knowledge, and they asked me, hey, what's your opinion on this? Big engines can't run on propane, what do you think? And all I could say is, I don't have a clue. I don't know how to spell propane, and I don't know. But what I did know, I thought, was the fundamental question I would ask. And I looked back at him, I said, if you can answer one question for me, then I will offer an opinion. And the questions, to me, seemed quite obvious, okay? So big engines need big amounts of fuel. So big steam engines burn more coal than small engines, and therefore they have bigger fireboxes, and so there's a correlation between the size of the firebox and the size of the engine you're going to run. And so there would be a similar correlation for any fuel. So my question would simply be, you are gated by how much coal you can burn in an engine because of the size of the grate. So if you tell me how many BTUs you can get per square or cubic inch of firebox, and then I ask you one simple question, can I get as many BTUs per hour out of propane from that same size or same area or volume? And if you'll answer that question, then I will hazard a guess. If the answer is yes, then I would say, yeah, you can probably run them on propane irrespective of how large they are. And if you can't, then that's the end of the exercise, because you're going to have to put a bigger firebox on or put a bigger grate or bigger burner than the grate area that you have. So I asked that question, and then I went back to sleep. And a few years later, long before Train Mountain decided that it was going to become mandatory to do here, Jimmy Booth came to me one time and said, hey, I'm going to build a propane burner, you know, and I said, that's great, build one for me too, and I'll pay for the parts, and you do the thought behind it, and we'll both be happy. And I don't have to know anything more about it than I know now, which is nothing. And he said, well, I'll do that, but he says, I don't know anything about it either. So we chuckled at each other, and we went through several iterations, and then Ray Barham got engaged, and he had a friend that was in the propane business, and he pointed out some of the stupidity of things that we were trying, and we had, went through, I still got a whole box of burners we made while we're trying to learn. And it was intriguing, but it was disappointing. Let's just say that the results were marginal at best. But then I realized, okay, if I'm going to do this, now it's got to go from this passive do it for me to I've got to engage a little bit intellectually. And so we started engaging intellectually and looking up some things. And pretty soon we had some knowledge and some calculations. And it happened to be a little bit more than people around us. And so they started asking us questions. And it went from this curiosity to where actually I was being asked for some advice. And I could offer some advice in a limited sense. So now we go back to the guy that had originally asked, did I have an opinion? And now I had an opinion. I looked at it, and I said, yeah, my opinion is it can be done. And so there was an attempt to do it on this large engine. And I was not in a position where I was able to do it. The request kept saying, would you please do this conversion? And my answer was no, but somebody else got engaged and decided to do it, and they asked me a simple question, which is, hey, obviously we need to know how many jets to put in there. Can you advise us on how many jets to put in this engine? I said, I can do that because I can calculate that, and we're going to get into that later. I can give you a number for the jets. And so I gave them that information and let them take over, and they went ahead and invested a lot of effort and what have you, made the burner, installed it, and what have you. And the result was, I was waiting to see what they said, and the result was disappointing. In fact, it never was satisfactory, and it was very frustrating to me because I didn't understand what's missing in here. Well, then along came Brandon McCracken one day, and he started to have a need to change. He has a very heavy 1.5-inch Pacific, and he kind of wanted to get in, and he came to me one day and said, hey, can you make some jets, and can we make a burner for this thing? And I said, yeah, that'd be intriguing. We can do that. So we engaged in doing that. The experience was a little different for me because I went ahead and tooled up and fixed my tracer lathe to make the jets and made them all. And when I gave the jets to Brandon, I also gave him the dimensions and the plumbing and the variety of things, but he's a very, very capable guy, and he took it from there and was phenomenally successful in changing this engine, and came up when it was first changed over to an operations meet here, and Ed was at the meet, and this engine, I think, outperformed everybody's expectations. It did really well, and I'm going to come back to that later because there's a parameter in there that's kind of interest. You look at it. And it's one that we hadn't thought of before, and it's one I didn't really think about when I wrote the article. So it's one I would share with you later. If I were to design a propane system for your engine today, I would look at that parameter, which I was smart enough to think about, but not smart enough to realize the value of it until I started seeing some of these results. So that was a decidedly different experience. I said I gave some technical information to some people to build a boiler system for one engine, and the results came back and they were not very good. In this case, I gave similar information to somebody else, and they took it forward, and they were quite successful. Similarly, we'll go back to Jimmy. I'm going to put you on the spot, Jimmy. I apologize. We were at a meet, and Jimmy happened to, come into the meet with one less engine than he left the meet with, and the engine he left was with the K27. And by then, Train Mountain had decided that propane was a requirement, and Jimmy was going to come up here a month later to the narrow gauge and meet, and thought, gee, I'd sure love to take this engine up there. And I think he wanted to get a little dig into the guy that he got the engine from, who was involved in some of the earlier things that were never successful. And he came to me and he said, I left something out. I'm going to come back in a minute. So he said to me, do you think we could make this thing run on propane in a month and have it at the narrow gauge meet? And I said, I don't know. Let me go look at the engine and see. So now I want to back up and tell you the piece I left out. At that same meet, I had already converted the K36 to propane. And I asked Jimmy if he wanted to run it. And I could tell he had mixed emotions. The answer was, do I want to run your K36? What is this, a stupid question? But it's on propane, So he took off in the engine, and he didn't tell me at the time. I didn't find out. He went off, and Jimmy, unlike the rest of us, doesn't just do this as an amateur. He drives the real locomotives, and he is one of the guys that really then understands how to drive a locomotive and what he's looking for. So when he goes out and runs one of these models, he's looking to drive it the same way he would drive a real one, which means he really is trying to tune the thing in and not get caught behind the power curve in any respect. So it's wonderful to watch him operate a locomotive. So he took off in the K36, and the first thing he did, he went down about 100 feet, and he was blowing off. And so I kidded him later. I said, hey, you told me at the Cumberson Toltec Railroad that's a fireable offense, setting off your safeties on that engine, and you blew my engine off. What it is? And he smiled at me and said, yeah, it took me to the one run to the top of the hill to understand. He was going to the maximus on this to figure out how to run the engine. And he didn't tell me anything more. So back to the story, he said, can we convert this K27? I said, it all depends on you. Let me go look at it. I looked at it. I came back and said, yeah. I looked at the dimensions. I said, yeah, I can give you the details you need to do that. You're going to need jets, because I'm not going to give up the stock of ones that I made, and you're going to need to figure out how to plumb it yourself. But I can tell you the dimensions and everything you need to do. And this was another one of those pleasant experiences like Brandon. Jimmy disappeared, and 1 month later, he reappeared up here with all the pieces and parts not yet assembled, but to go into this operations meet. And I was coming up here for, I'm sorry, that wasn't operation, this was the narrow gauge meet. I'm coming up the day or two after him, and so he's going to have this thing running, and I come up here and I'm looking at him and say, well, did it work? Did it work? Did it work? Because I've had these experiences on both sides, and I got all these Cheshire cat grins, and the group around there, including Ben, who made the jets for him, they were looking like Cheshire cats, and it was kind of funny because they told me the story. Wyatt was involved, and he said, well, we showed up, and it was the work week before the narrow gauge meet. We show up with this big K27. They got all this ballast they need to move these heavy cars. They saw the K27 come in. They said, okay, get over here, pick up those ballast cars. And Jimmy says, okay. And Wyatt, as I understand the story, he said, hey, Jimmy, we don't even know if it works. We haven't even put the burners in it yet. And Jimmy said, well, I guess we'll find out, won't we? So it was going to be a test by fire. It was either going to be a phenomenal success or a very embarrassing failure. And by the reaction that was given to me when I got here, it blew people's socks off. And it was the discussion topic of the time. And in fact, a lot of the notoriety that has come back associated with this now was predicated on kind of that event. Oh my gosh, the following year, that was in 21, following year 22 was the narrow gauge meet, and we decided, well, we'll bring the K-27, we'll bring the K-36, we get these big engines up here, we're going to really show what they can do. And we did, and it was noteworthy, and there was a tremendous amount of discussion, and people kept coming over afterward and saying, how did you do it? What did you do? I mean, the 36 was the equivalent of the engine that had been here for years, that had been unsuccessful through several attempts and had literally not run on the track successfully since the transition. And so someone pulled me aside and said, you have to chronicle this. You have to, I had this chart we're going to go through here. I had a rudimentary version of that. I had a lot of data by then that I'd done a lot of calculations that hadn't been put into engines, but I'd gone through this thing mentally, and I had all of that data. And this guy looked at it and said, you just have to publish this, and you owe it to the hobby. And so I felt guilty and said, okay. And so I wrote the article based on that request, based on that TM Triennial experience and what people had noticed. And so that's what kind of started this ball rolling. And it's picked up steam, so to speak, since then. So that's the kind of the background of how we got here. And then from that narrow gauge meet to that 22 Triennial and the Lifesteam magazine article is sort of the history. So back to the discussion topic, I've gone to how we got here, the requests that have come in, and the expectations and the changes that went through. So I want to talk about some of the fundamentals that I put in the article. And in particular, I started the article by talking about the difference between temperature and heat. And they're two different parameters. You know, heat is the same as energy. And I indicated in there that a longtime railroader I learned a lot from had warned me. He says, you can never run an engine on propane because you don't get that same heat you get out of coal. When you blow oxygen through coal, you get that great glowing red, and that's just hot. You don't get that from propane. Well, as I pointed out in the article, the combustion temperature of most of these hydrocarbon fuels is basically the same. So I would say to you, for instance, if you said, I'm going to jump in a rocket ship and fly to the sun, but it gets hotter and hotter as I get closer to the sun. Well, what gets hotter? The sun doesn't get any hotter. Sun doesn't know you're coming, doesn't care, doesn't say, I'm going to get hotter because you're coming. You actually start absorbing more radiation and you gain more heat out of it. So that's basically the difference. And what's going on inside your firebox is if you need more heat out of coal, you just need to burn more coal faster. If you want more heat out of propane, you need to burn more propane. But the propane burns at a relatively fixed temperature, which is relatively the same as what the coal burns at. Now, there are some differences, and I'll point them out just to briefly say. The heat that radiates from a coal fire comes from two different sources. And so this goes back to the question that was brought up to me about that hot bed of coal. There are the volatiles that are driven out of the coal by the heat, and those are carbohydrate gases, and they burn very similar to propane. But of course, propane, methane, ethane, butane, they all burn at the different temperatures because there's different amounts of energy in the molecules, but the chemistry is the same, and basically they operate the same. Coal also has char or carbon in it, and the carbon that's left behind in the bed actually undergoes its own chemical reaction combining with oxygen, and it changes and gives off the heat, but without converting to a gas. And so that's another process that produces heat from there, but that process is at a lower temperature and provides less heat energy than the burning gases. So the coal bed actually is less of a heat contributor than in fact the gas. So now that's another thing in favor of the propane, which is a pure gas. Something that works against the propane is it's cold. As you all know, when it expands, it gets cold, so it goes through the jet, which is, by the way, one of the things that keeps the jet from melting. You ever wonder why a brass jet sitting in that fire doesn't melt? It's partly because of where it is and where the flame is, and it's partly because the propane is cold and the propane is blowing past it in that direction. That's important to understand, along with the fact that as most people in the business understand, most of the heat energy is transferred from the fuel to the water in the firebox, not in the flues, which may seem counterintuitive because the flues have a lot more surface area to transfer heat than the firebox. But the biggest difference is the fact that there is radiated heat and there is convective heat. So if you stand in the sun outside, you feel the radiated heat. It's hot. If you step into the shade, it blocks the sun and it blocks the radiated heat, but you get the convected heat because the warm air is in. So you see there's a big difference. So the heat that transfers in the firebox is largely radiated heat, radiated from the burning coal or radiated from the propane flame. And then the combustion gases, which presumably are fairly well burned by that time, enter the flues. And that's like the breeze under the trees, and it has to transfer the heat through the convection process into the walls. And so it's a much, much less efficient. And not only that, but there's typically no flame in there, so it's at a much cooler temperature anyway, as well as having less ability to transfer the heat. So being in the firebox is important. And the reason I bring that up is because one of the questions we have to talk about is where do you put the flame? How high do you put the flame? And as everyone knows, clearly you would put the flame as low as you can so you get the benefit of radiating heat to the sides of the firebox as well as to the top of it. And I violated that grossly in the K36, and I talk about that, and I did it knowingly, and I did it on purpose because I wanted to leave all of this fancy operating grates in there so I could go back to coal at any time I wanted, and that meant I put tall jets on top of a frame, on top of the operating grid. So basically, in the K36, I am radiating the heat into the crown sheet and into the upper parts of the firebox and nowhere else. It's got to be clear I am losing a lot of the surface area, and in spite of that, the K36 is a screaming machine on propane, and that also gives you a little bit of clue as to how many BTUs you can transfer. Now, I put in there one caveat that's a little different than a prototype engine. You know, a typical prototype engine of the type that we would have had 2.5, maybe 3-inch flues, not counting the superheater flues, and they're steel, and they're 200 mils thick or a quarter of an inch or something like that. And so you're transferring heat through a steel plate, which is the same as the firebox, and we're using, 16th inch or greater copper, which has a much more effective transfer, so we pick up some benefits that they wouldn't have. And so some of these things trade off. So that all comes into it. I want to move ahead here. I'm going to go too long. The next thing I put on after talking about temperature and heat is pressure and volume, and that comes up all the time. Been a lot of dialogue. What pressure do I need? What volume do I need? And I've got a pressure problem. No, I got a volume problem and all that. And again, as I mentioned in the article, pressure and volume, or flow rate, let's call it flow rate, all else being equal, are proxies for each other because they're typically the inverse, And so it doesn't make a lot of sense to talk about pressure or volume because you can't talk about pressure. When you're talking about pressure, you're talking about volume and vice versa. But I want to add in there a third dimension, which is the orifice. And by orifice, I mean any restriction anywhere in the system. So the orifice not only in the jet, but any other restriction you have in the system. And I bring up the word system because that's really important. Again, I point that out at the beginning of the article. My approach to doing this was saying, I don't want to just put in a burner. I don't want to just change to propane. I'm not just going to put in some jets, which is the way it had been approached by the people more successful. I'm going to look at, as an engineer, I'm going to say, I have a propane firing system. And that systemic view includes everything associated with that. So it starts with the container providing the propane until it burns and goes out the stack is part of that system. And that systemic view is critical to most of the things I've seen that don't work, because somebody focuses, oh, I'm going to use this jet or that jet. Well, what does that mean over here? We'll see that again when we get into the calculations. And without looking at that, they're wasting all they're rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. And I'm going to solve the problem, I'm going to put this jet in there, it's going to make everything work well. It never was the jet problem, it was something else. So we'll make that clear. So when you talk about pressure or volume, let's dispense with that. Let's think about the dynamic range for the system, meaning can it do what we want, and the dynamic range of the individual jets if we're going to go with a jet system, which there are alternatives, of course, barbecue systems, there's slotted jets, there's impinged jets, et cetera, et cetera. We could talk about all that if you want. The third area that I think is critical to understand is air. And air is fundamental to this. I mean, basically, all we are doing is combining a hydrocarbon with oxygen. And the oxygen comes from the air, and that's the chemical process we're doing. And therefore, you have to make sure that you have sufficient air in the appropriate proximity to the hydrocarbon with the heat so the chemical process can take place. And a lot of the myths, in fact, we fell in this trap. I don't know if you remember, Jimmy, us trying to figure out whether the old myth of losing all our heat up the stack because of the excess air and blah, blah, blah. Excess air, you hear the term excess air. Excess air is bad. It takes all the heat out the stack. Excess air is neither good nor bad. It is either. But excess air is, in fact, a technical term which is applied. There's at least 4 different types of air that the industry would look at. There's the primary air. We all know that. That's where the flame initiates. It's it's always insufficient to completely combust the product. So there's secondary air. The intent of the secondary area is to bring more oxygen content with the unburned hydrocarbons so you can continue the process. And that hopefully is sufficient. But it's not, because in our systems they're not completely engineered where you ever get enough good mixing so the oxygen gets next to the hydrocarbon that it needs. So you need some additional opportunity for it to burn, and that's where excess air comes in. Excess air is in fact required in most systems to complete the combustion process. And so you need excess air, and in fact, the better engineered the system is, the less you need, down to potentially 0 theoretically. But the worse your system is engineered for the system, which ours are by default not very good, the more excess air you need. And in general, 5 to 15 to 25% excess air is not unreasonable to be required. And so when people go to a lot of trouble to start putting baffles in, separating them, and they're very clever, they put a piece of sheet metal in there and they put the jet burner through the hole, and they say, I'm keeping all of the air the excess because it takes all this heat up. It's a lack of understanding of what they're really doing. They're really compromising it. So my attitude is, forget it, don't worry about it. You need probably 15, 20% excess air anyway, and you're probably lucky if you can get it, because we clutter the bottom of this thing with all this piping and these big tubes and all that, and so we're blocking half the air that we'd want. If you were burning coal, you'd want that all open, right? You want your grate to be a certain size. You want all the air to go through there. So I don't worry much about excess air, other than the fact that my attitude is kind of open it up as much as you can, and if that's your only problem, then you're probably winning anyway. Don't worry about it. And the fourth type of air is dilution air is not relevant to our conversation. So the air is also affected and required by looking at the number of jets that you have, assuming this conversation is really centered around the assumption of slotted jets. So let's stick with slotted jets, and if we have to get off on some specific other ones, we can. But can you have too many jets? Boy, you sure can. And I didn't understand that at first. I thought, boy, what you do is you put as many jets as you can fit in the space there, and if you have too many, you can always take them out. But if you take them out, you can't change the spacing of the holes that are in there. And so that was a bad assumption, and I think it's very ill-advised to start with, I'm going to take a piece of real estate and populate it with as many jets as I can. Wrong answer, because not only is the jet going to fight the other jets for the air, but it's going to require some plumbing to it, which is going to compromise the airflow, so you can absolutely put in too many jets, and there's still people trying to do that. I think that increasing spacing, I think that selective spacing, this is something I haven't said before except to a couple of people, it wasn't in the article. I am now of the opinion that if you have a large array of jets, like in my case, the K-36 has got 54 jets, and of the 54 jets, if you count the ones around the outside, I think there's 24 or 26 that go around the outside, and there are more than that interior to that, meaning that less than half of the jets, somewhat less than half the jets, are only fighting a jet on one side, and the other is the outside space. And so if you space it in enough, it can get lots of air from the outside, but the inner ones are all fighting each other. That suggests to me that a good design would probably have two different densities. If it's a big matrix like that, perhaps you use a density on the outside ones and you use a different pattern inside. Now, I haven't had a chance to try that out or play with that, but if you look at a big burner like that and you look at the yellow flame, which is the clue, where's the yellow flame? It's typically in the center. So that's a second, that's your dead giveaway. You can move things from the outside and you can get air to them. So that's another sort of a trick. Now, that also suggests arch, baffles, shutters, petticoat, turbulators. All of these things come into that, and I'm going to not talk specifically about them now because I'm going to run out of time if I do. But I think they all play a role, with the possible exception of turbulators. Let me just say that I've never played with them, experimented with them, but if you really think about the physics and the flows and all that, I cannot justify what a turbulator is supposed to do. I know there's two implications for why they would add value, but I can't believe that they really do more than they would compromise. So I don't offer an informed opinion. I offer a personal opinion that I think that they would be more trouble than they would be worth, because clearly they offer trouble. Well, if you stay with propane, it doesn't matter, but if you ever have to clean your flues, they're painful. And I just can't imagine they give back anything more than they would take away. But the conclusion from these last few things I'm talking about is, I said before, we used to start by designing, by taking, here's how much real estate I have, and by using these rough design rules, how many jets can I crowd in there? And I am now saying, don't start there. Start with looking at the gas pressure at the jet, and I'll show you why at the end. That now becomes a really intriguing discussion. If I can design so that I can hit a certain gas pressure on each jet, and if I then look at the total BTUs I can get from that number of jets at that gas pressure, if you have the number that matches the engine requirement, which is the other thing you have to calculate, stop there. You've got an answer. Don't say, I could squeeze in more because I got the real estate. Don't even start. Don't even worry about it. And so that'll become more clear a little bit later as well. Some indicators of some problems that people have brought to me. They've sent me pictures. They've shown me locomotives, melted jets, soot on the jets, soot elsewhere, a yellow flame, a high flame sitting off the top of the jet, a sucked out flame. You know, every time the engine starts to chuff, it sucks your flame out, or the smell of propane. If you're doing this right, you shouldn't smell propane, even when you shut the throttle off, because then you turn the blower on. But inadequate power, the dynamic response, the range up and down. You know, you go all the way up to Hope Circle and you're struggling to keep power up and you're coming all the way back from hope and you can't stop blowing off and you don't want to have to shut your engine off because you have to keep relighting it. Those are all things that we would take into effect. I talked about the sucked out flame and the smell. So the last one on this is the radiant versus convection, the fireboxes versus flues, coal versus propane. I've talked about those. I've talked a little bit about coal versus propane, so I'm going to skip on that. And let's go over to this quantitative aspects here. And I'm going to start with a chart. Don't let this intimidate you, and you don't have to read the numbers from there. I'll point out the ones that are important. But this starts with a variety of parameters on the upper left-hand side there. These are all what are known as independent variables. And for those of you in the audience who want to argue, as one of my friends does, that the term independent variable doesn't make any sense. How can something be independent, be a variable? I says it's an engineering term. Suck it up and move on. And he still this day still argues, but an independent variable is something that's a given that you have to start with, and a dependent or a derived variable then is a consequence of the independent variable. So the independent variables are up there: the cylinder bore, the stroke, the operating boiler pressure, blah, 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 road speed, all those things that are given by the engine. And so if you came to me and said, help me with this, I'd say, well, tell me about your engine, give me those things right there. And everything below I can calculate from that. And across the top of this is just a bunch of engines, and I picked out some that we've done over the years that were of interest. And I'll come back to this a couple times to show you the conclusions as to what's good and what's bad and why you draw some assumptions. But if you took that and you said, I've got this C16 or this Shea or the K36, another C16, the 1.5 Pacific is the one I talked about earlier, a C19, the K27 I talked about earlier, C16, Mogul, Berkshire, Pacific, 10-wheeler, and another engine. These last two, I don't know the engines. I'm not familiar with them, but there was data that was given to me, and I did the calculations anyway, and I understand one of those engines is in fact running, and I had a real fun discussion with, it's Ben's engine. I had a real fun discussion with him just yesterday about that, because he told me how well it operates, and so I went back and looked at this and said, I could have told you before you build it, based on this, why it was going to operate that well. There is a common denominator here at the bottom, and I'm going to come to that later. But let's just say, okay, so this is where you can calculate things ultimately about how much energy is required. So if you go down there, you see, you can calculate the pressures and horsepowers and all those things. You get down near the bottom and you can figure out how much grade area you have and how many jets per horsepower and tractive effort and a whole bunch of things. But the ones that are intriguing are, the third one up from the bottom is net BTUs per hour required by the gross horsepower that's been calculated from this at 5% efficiency, which is a reasonable number for our engines. They're external combustion engines, and it means basically that 95% of what you pay for in the fuel goes to global warming. You can tell Al Gore. The other 5% went, if you're lucky, to making your engine move and hauling that's just the reality of it. But that's of interest because that's the first clue that tells us, well, how many jets do we need? What are we going to, is this propane system going to work? Well, if I look there at the net BTUs required for that horsepower, then I sort of know now what I need. Now I got to go see if I can find it. The last one I'm going to emphasize at the end because it's kind of intriguing. That is the calculated pressure, given that you have the configuration I've just described to get that amount of BTUs. What pressure should it ideally operate at? And that ends up being particularly intriguing. So I'm going to come back to that, but let's go to the next page first. This is the other half of the equation. So I now know what I need. The question is, where do I get it? And if you take one slide out of here that will help you, take this one, because you can cheat to get to the answer pretty quickly. But I'm going to show you something kind of interesting about that answers a question I brought up earlier. At the top there is a number 70 orifice jet. And it was the one that Marty Siegel at Golden Gate Live Steamers drew up, which is the one that I copied and made. And that was written up, I don't know, 30, 40 years. Jeff, how long ago did you put?
84, 86.
Thank you. So a long time ago, Marty Siegel at Golden Gate was helping people develop propane systems. And they were using a solar flow jet that they could buy from Solar Flow, who makes them for the typical purposes they're all made for, which is like your home furnace, okay? And people were buying them and putting in the systems per his instructions. And the story was told to me by Steve Vitkovitz, a very, very, very knowledgeable person in this hobby. And he said that one day somebody called Solar Flow to buy some of these things, and they said, "What are you using them for?" And he said, "Well, I'm building this, live steam locomotive." And Solar Flow went non-linear and said, "Oh my God!" I mean, the attorney just scared them to death, and they just quit. They wouldn't release them to anybody like us that they was going to use them in some kind of an unapproved service. And so Marty, in frustration, sat down, and I think, as best I can tell, just copied that drawing. He did leave out one important dimension in there, which caused me I had to kind of regenerate that, and it went through an iteration with Ben. When he tried to do it, I gave him the numbers I first used, and they were wrong. And then I figured out what the right numbers were. But I asked Jeff a question too, because I should have put Jeff up there, because he didn't have that jet. He has other. Are your others come from Solar Flow, or they were, they're proprietary ones? Yeah, okay. They're similar. They look like, but the point is that if you pick the jet is typically designed to operate, as I suggested, in a home heating system. And it's expecting to see a certain gas pressure and a certain airflow, and it's expecting to see that every time. When you decide that you want your house to be hotter, you don't turn up the gas pressure. You don't turn up the oxygen. What do? You turn up the thermostat, which means it just stays on longer. So it's like we said, going to the moon. Your house operates, it maintains its temperature by the duration that it makes heat, not the temperature coming out of the air. You just collect more warm air. And so these jets expect to see that sort of a pressure, which is nominally about 0.4 to 0.5, half a psi or less. And they're designed with the primary air holes to accommodate the gas flow that goes through that size orifice at that pressure and needs this amount of air. And then the rest of the plenum and the thing is designed to provide the secondary air, and it expects to have about 2 feet of space up in there for it to all mix, not 3 inches like we have. And that's how the whole thing is designed to operate. And we're using that as our fundamental starting point. This jet is not being throttled up and down and changing gas pressure in probably any other use that it has. Maybe there's some, but clearly not like ours. So we are using them in a non-engineered way. If you really wanted to engineer that, you would go from what our system is just a atmospheric system, and a system that would recognize the problem I just had would be a forced air system, not forced air like the air blowing through your heating ducts at home. But what it means is you would pressurize the primary air and control that. You would pressurize the secondary air and control that. And you would pressurize the gas and control that. And when you turn up the gas, you'd turn up the primary air accordingly, or you'd turn up the secondary. And that's how you would tune the system to do that. Our primary air is controlled by that little hole in the side of the jet. And when the gas goes through there, the venturi sucks in the amount of air that it can based on the pressure differential it creates, and that's fixed. And it doesn't mean that as you turn the gas up, that the corresponding amount of oxygen you need correlates to that, and in fact, it doesn't. If you go through this, if you go through the physics and you look at it, there's a bell-shaped curve, and if it operates right in the center of that thing, it's hunky-dory and it's happy as a pig in slop. And if you move off-center from that to increase or decrease the pressure, you move down that efficiency curve and you are getting inadequate mixing, and it costs you. In other words, you're not getting the energy out of the propane that you want. So, as I said, if we're going to do this for a living, we'd have to worry about that. We don't care. We don't care if we spend an extra $1 worth of gas. In fact, we'd spend more than that, wouldn't we? Because we want the convenience of being able to change that. So we deal with that. But that's an important takeaway, because I said earlier I'm going to come to a conclusion at the end about something I would look at now that I had never looked at before, and it's for that very reason those jets would like to see a constant pressure, and typically it is a low pressure, okay? And we turn it up to 1 or 2 or 3 pounds and it works, that's fine. But you're not getting out of it what you could, and in fact the number of jets you'd use might be different if you did something. So what I've done down the left side is really quite simple. I just took a bunch of things. I talked about the system, the propane system. Everything from the first pipe through the regulator down to the end, and I put a bunch of those down just to see what it would be. So there's a jet, and then there's another jet with a smaller orifice, and then there's a modified Marty. Somebody wanted to make it easy to make one, so you make it out of pipe, and it didn't really look like the regular jet. And then I put in there, just to put things in perspective, an 1/8-inch pipe, a 1/4-inch pipe, a 3/8-inch pipe, some needle valves, a ball valve, and then I put a bunch of engine burner requirements. And I go all the way from a 14-jet burner in a 10-wheeler to a 20-jet burner C16 down to a C19, and then I get all the way up to a K36, and I've got 3 burners in there, and there's, 18 jets in each burner, and so I can turn on 18 at a time up to 54. So if you want to take 54 of the first line item up there and put them in that bottom one, that's what those numbers are, and that's how they all relate. The first thing that you see is kind of interesting. So I told you about the engine here. We had the discussion at Melita's, and they tried it and it didn't work, and I called the guy later and I said, I can't figure out why it didn't work, but tell me, what did you use to regulate that? Did you put in a needle valve? Yeah. What needle valve did you use? Well, I don't know. I used a needle valve. I always needle. I said, oh, well, how big is the orifice in the needle valve? Well, I don't know. It's just a needle valve, right? Okay, so this is what's intriguing to me. That number 70 jet up there by itself, and let's just use we'll use a constant pressure to go down here. And let's use the BTUs, okay? So a number 70 jet at a 1/4 PSI, in theory, gives us 4,400 BTUs. Now, granted, if you start increasing the pressure, it goes up to 60 and 8,000, blah, blah, blah. We're going to stay in this column. So I got 4,000 BTUs from a single jet in that engine. Now, if I went to the other slide again, and I said I've got, let's pick this K27. How many BTUs do I need? Help me, Ed. Or do I have it in horsepower on here? I don't remember. There's BTUs, it's right there. Is that one right there? I need 280,000 BTUs per hour to run that engine to get the horsepower out of it. 280,000 BTUs. Put the first chart back up there. At a 1/4 pound, I get 4,000 per. Okay, so if I divide 280,000 by 4,000, I get, whatever the number is. It's 40 jets or some darn thing. I say, okay, so I need 40 jets of that orifice size to get that horsepower. So I put together my system, and in the system, I just told you the story. I put in a needle valve, and I said, how big is the orifice in the needle valve? And the answer was, I don't know, but let's suppose that it's this needle valve right here with another 47 orifice, which is a very common needle valve, which I've seen in a lot of locomotives. And you go across here, that number 47, and it shows you that that jet has 6/10,000ths of an inch projected area, and that needle valve is 4.8 thousandths of a square inch in area. But if I'm down here at this K27 and I've got all these burners in there, that has a collective requirement of all of those jets added up of 25 thousandths of a square inch, or a huge multiple of that. And this number in between there gates that. So I'm going from 4,000, I'm adding enough jets to get to the 200 plus thousand I needed, and that's down here, wherever it is, 183,000. Okay, I want to get from 4,000 to 183,000. At a quarter PSI, if I have to go through a number 47 needle valve, it'll put out 34,000. To get above 34,000, I have to go up to a higher pressure. But if I go up to higher pressure there, I get more BTUs required and more BTUs down here. In other words, that blocks it. You cannot get from 4,000 BTUs to 183,000 BTUs by running through a needle valve which maxes out at 34,000. In fact, if you divide that by that, it's, what is it, roughly 8 or 10, I guess, 9, something like that. That tells me that I can only put 9 jets in with that needle valve, and that's all you can do. And so, think about it. People did small locomotives, and they did bigger and bigger locomotives, and they just started adding jets. But they used the same needle valve. And so if someone says to you, gee, my needle valve doesn't work, I've got a pressure problem, or I don't have a pressure problem, I've got a volume problem. So I'm going to solve it, I'm going to take the needle valve and put in a ball valve. Well, you don't want to run your engine with a ball valve because you don't like the control. Well, but look, the ball valve's in here somewhere. Full flow ball valve, hell, it's good to 500,000 BTUs. Of course it's going to work. So what was wrong with trying to make that big engine run? It's right there in the table. You didn't design the system. You just put a bunch of jets in and you left everything else be the same. And so that to me explains, probably, it's a logical, unless somebody tells me otherwise, it's a very logical explanation. No wonder these guys figured out that the engines wouldn't work. And it didn't have anything to do with the engine not working or none of the engine working. It's all in the math. They just didn't look at it as a system. And so that was the disappointment to me when I handed this off to people. They didn't look at it as a system. If you look at that as a system, you look at everything in there. It'd be like the fire department coming up to put out a house fire and saying to you, we got this big pumper, it'll pump 2,000 GPM of water, and we got a 3-inch hose, we want to hook it up. Where's your garden hose? You know? I'm going to hook it up to your garden line, and I don't know why I don't get 2,000 GPM out the other end of the fire truck. The fire truck's capable of pumping it, but I'm feeding it with a 3/4 inch water hose. That's exactly what I believe was going on, and so that would explain the whole thing. Now, it was really quite simple, and so if you look at here, there's a needle valve with a number 22 hole. It only took me 10 minutes on a web search to find that little thing, and you can buy that from our friends out here. And look at the difference. When you go from a needle valve with a 47 hole to a 22, you go from a gating factor of 34,000 to 137,000 BTUs at a quarter PSI. And just to share just a piece of the physics with you is that you run into a limiting factor when you increase the pressure differential through any orifice. You got a high pressure side and a low pressure side. And if you increase the orifice size, okay, the flow rate can increase. And when the flow rate increases, the velocity goes down. Okay, the pressure differential changes. The flip side is when you restrict it down, in order to get the flow through there, it has to go faster. And you go through these small things, it has to go faster and faster and faster. So you start increasing the pressure, and it'll go faster, and you increase the pressure, it'll go faster again until what happens? when it gets to the speed of sound, the gas is trying to go supersonic. And as everybody knows, a lot of funny things happen when you get to go supersonic. What happens is the physics end up blocking it. It's called the choking point, and it will not go beyond that. And so the needle valve itself reaches the choke point, and that's it. So when you you can increase that pressure, sure, and you can go from the 34 to 48 to 68 to 96, but you can't just keep increasing the pressure, because at a point right in here where the gas has to go faster than the speed of sound in that gas, and it won't do it. The physics block it. It takes too much energy, and the energy is lost in the turbulence and the transfer. So it's a great big fat stop. So that's why that valve won't work. You can't just keep turning the pressure up. So that's physically what happens. Okay, so I think that's enough about the sort of the takeaways are you can do some calculations, but I want to mention one more thing. You'll notice in there that I talked about a burner section. So on the K36 and in the K27, there's 3 sections. Now, so why do we section the burner? Well, for several reasons. First reason, the K36 is I wanted to put the burner in through the fire door. I had to cut it in 3 pieces. Okay. But it also does wonders for the control. Because we talked earlier, so if we go to the other, wait a minute. Yeah, go to the other chart. I told you that we had this phenomenal experience with this Pacific. This Pacific came up here and went to this operations meet and just performed like crazy. This K27 here came up here for that experience at the narrow gauge meet and then the Triennial and performed like crazy. And look what they have in common. This bottom row I talked about is the pressure that's needed to achieve what you want to do. And the C16, my little C16, sucks from that standpoint. It just needs 1/2 pounds. And that's a consequence of the fact that it has that stupid little keyhole. You ask about a small keyhole. It's got a keyhole firebox, and so because there's a little bit of space for the, and that's why the railroads don't do that anymore anyway, but it's difficult to get what you need out of that. But these 2 engines I just pointed in here both have, look, 0.56 and 0.58. It's these 2 right here. They are among the lowest pressure required in order to get the BTUs. So that was the discussion I was having with Ben, and I hadn't looked at his over here, and he said, this engine runs like crazy. And I pulled this chart out. I made this chart years ago, and I looked at it, and look at this number here, it's 0.32. And I smiled at him, and I said, I could have told you that your engine was going to run like that before you built it, before you told me. So I said that one of the takeaways from this is that I think that designing for this last line here, designing so that the jets operate in the median of that curve at lower pressure would add some value. Now that's an interesting thing, because on the one hand I said let's reduce the number of jets, but in order to reduce the pressure for each jet, you could increase the number of jets. So if I got more jets, then I use less pressure in each one and it operates better. So if I add jets so that I can reduce the pressure to make it more efficient, as it becomes more efficient, I can reduce the number. The point is you can go into an optimization where the right number is somewhere in between that allows you to take the maximum advantage. So if I would design a system today, I would design it with that. I would absolutely not put more jets in that compromise the air we talked about. I would reduce the number, but I wouldn't reduce the number too low so that I start requiring a higher pressure than the jet would operate well on. So I like to divide the burner system into 1 or 2 or 3 different sections. And then I can have a course control where I turn on 1 or 2 or 3, and a fine control where I go ahead and I play with the pressure of each one and take the consequences. And what it would allow me to do here is I can, give nosebleeds at 50 yards and storm up the hill in the K-36 and blow trees over, and I can go around Hope Circle and turn around a corner, and I can turn 2 of them off and turn the other one down and come all the way down happy as a pig in slop, as I said before, and never blow off and never suck out the flames in between. And so as a consideration for the design is to do that. But it also, in this case, I have no choice. I had to use at least 2 jets because if I go back to the exercise I showed you before, even the larger, not jets, 2 needle valves, even the larger needle valve by itself will not supply enough for 54 jets. And because I cut it in 3 pieces, I had to have 1 for each anyway, so I had to have 3. All right, so let's move to go back to the topical slide. I think I've gone through everything down to here. I'm going to end up fairly quickly here. I said, well, let's talk about designing a system for you. What's important? Some of this will sound like a repeat, but in summary, the jets and burners. The style of the jet, you got choices for different styles of jet. You've got different choices for manufacturers, but the manufacturers are all saddled with the same problem I just described. So they're making a comparable product. So if you are going to choose one over the other, you need to understand why you're doing that. The size of the jet, the size of the hole, the orifice, the quantity, too few, too many, the geometric layout and distances. And in the article, I put in some comments about the recommended distances, and I got those from Jeff at Local Parts, and I've discussed it with him since then. I think we've both moved in a common direction, haven't we? That we think that we're now advising greater spacing than even we put in the article. Is that right? Yeah. And Ben, you agree with that? And those of you that have been doing this, I think, Jimmy, I think we've all concluded that greater spacing, for all the reasons I've described, is healthier. And if I wrote the article again today, I would recommend staying away from the minimum spacing that I put in the article. And I kind of looking to Jeff as the...
Yeah, and one of the reasons for that minimum spacing, and that minimum spacing in the slide and what we recommended to you years ago, it was basically 2-inch spacing.
Yep.
And that's to keep them from interacting. Well, one of the problems that we're seeing, and Bill didn't really point on this, is the volume in the firebox where combustion occurs. By getting that spacing, it gives more area in that firebox for that combustion to occur. So by doing that spacing, it gives the air that he talked about to be able to let the burner operate more efficiently, so you can keep those pressures, propane pressures lower, and get the efficiency out of the burners to stay at that belt, the optimum peak of that belt.
Yeah, so everybody who's been through this sort of agrees we're looking at some different numbers than the past. I talked about the air, the required air in general is 24-to-1 for gas by volume. Now, I don't expect you to calculate that. That's sort of built in than we've said, but what I'm just telling you, the amount of air that's required to do this is huge. And so I think we're all in agreement as well. Clear out the bottom. Don't put any more pipes or any more clutter in the bottom than you need. I think it's important to think about airflow in 2 respects, pre-combustion and post-combustion. So when you were firing by coal, you had to not let there be holes in the fire in the grate, right? Because if there's a hole in the coal, all the air goes through the hole and straight out the flues, and you want it to go through the coal where it's burning. Well, this is not too dissimilar. You want the air to go through all of the jets. And so a baffle underneath, sometimes in my Shay, I absolutely had to put some shutters below it in order, because the air wanted to go in and favor some jets and go straight up over the arch and out. And so a baffle or a shutter which causes the air to flow and mix through all of them. And then the combustion products, that's the purpose of the arch. The same thing. Once the products come off, to have it go up, have the additional length of the path so the air can interact and you can get all of the burning done in the firebox and also have more time in there to transfer the heat. You should look at, I mentioned 5 to 20% excess air. Okay. The capacities, the control, the piping, everywhere there's a pipe in there, everywhere there's a control in there, we point out the regulator. People put a regulator on their propane bottle, and the reason for that is you don't want the high pressure of the bottle to come out, but that's the sole purpose of that. That's just to reduce the pressure, and you can leave it at 10, 15, 20, 30. It's a sort of a don't care. All you're doing is keeping the full pressure of the bottle in there, but you're actually going to control the flow at the needle valve, because we're now all going to use needle. Nobody's going to use a ball valve after we just discussed this. You're all going to get the right number of needle valves and you can use it. But if you're going to put a pressure gauge in there to measure it, don't call me and tell me you got plenty of pressure because you got the so 30 pounds on your bottle. I don't care.
You vary it based on the need of the primary air.
Yeah, but where are you going to measure it? You're going to measure it after the needle valve because that's all that you care about. It's the air going, and so Ed and I have talked about this before. You described some of the problems and described me. I said, I can tell you what the pressure is where it needs to be. The pressure needs to be at whatever it is here at the jet, and I can tell you the pressure is 0. When you tell me you have a volume problem, I said, yeah, your pressure is 0. You basically opened up every tap at your house, and you wonder why you don't get much dribble of water out there because the pressure is 0 for all, because you opened up more holes. That calculation I started off with, the orifice, the collective orifice sizes versus the orifice in the needle valve is a ratio that doesn't work. How you control it, the gas pressure, we talked about the modulation in flow rate, airflow pathway. And let me summarize by saying that you really need, and I think the biggest contribution that I started with in bringing to this is just taking a systemic look. And so recognize that everything that affects it is important. And I would start by doing the calculations, like I said before, based on the final pressure and all that. So I'm going to stop my comments on there and now move to this thing where we say some highlights. And I've written down a half a dozen that I think are takeaway. I should have put them up on the slide, but I'm going to ask you guys, and if you don't get some of these, I would. But so what are your takeaways? What if you went out to design your system or modify your system? What's an important takeaway from this discussion? Even if you knew it before, what would you say?
Oh, you. When I first got into this business, they were all coal burners. The first thing they told me was, when you get up this fire and you're going, turn the damn blower off, right? And you're going to suck all the air out of the firebox by doing that. And so that's why I put a pressure gauge on my blower, and I use a 60 psi pressure gauge because I tried out with 30 first, but when you first fire up the burner, it's lower. But then when you turn on the air, once you had it set to the blower, you end up burning up the breaking pressure gauge. So don't let those old timers tell you to turn the pressure your blower off when you're up and running. I'm sorry.
That's okay. Thank you. I saw a hand back there. Yes?
Well, make them small enough to fit, and you have airspace, because you
Yeah.
fill it up too much, but they also, somebody can't reach in.
Yeah.
You know?
24-1. That ratio for me was eye-opening at just how much volume of air you need to be thinking about getting up into your firebox.
Yeah.
It's easy to think that the propane side is where you're staring at and going, how much propane am I getting in there? But if you don't have that 24-1 air coming in, more propane isn't going to help.
Yeah, you don't have mixing, you need even more to do that. And don't worry about the excess beyond that.
drafting through a flues and through your chimney. So how you manage to get good induction from the exhaust or from the blower to get that airflow, because you can have as big a grill under your burners as you want. You can have as many burners as you want to burn, but if you can't get combustion gases through the boiler and out of the chimney, you won't get anywhere. Down the property, the whole lot on kitchen exhaust and all that kind of stuff to get flow out of the chimney. That's where it has to go.
Yeah, so let me share with you the half a dozen I wrote down that I hope came through. I said that all components in the system must support the system performance requirements. Systemic view. I hope that's a key takeaway. Another one I said is there can be too few jets, but there can also be too many. And one of the design that I was on the periphery of, I was unaware of, I calculated the desired number of jets for that engine was 54. And I was told that the owner of the engine had asked for a design to put in 68. Again, with the sort of logic I talked about earlier, as well, you can always take some out and move them around. And I think I think we've all agreed, even these guys that are in the business, that's a mistake. Don't do that. The one that was mentioned here again is, I said, it's doubtful to me, this is Matt's point, that there is such a thing as too much excess air in our sport. I would consider variable spacing. I've never made a burner with variable spacing, but now if I had the K36 is 9x6, that's a big garden of jets. I would use different spacing on it and see what the result is. Don't confuse or conflate cause and effect. If you look at it and you say, this doesn't work, I'm going to make it work, that engine works, what jet did they use? I'm going to go replace all my jets with those jets and I'm going to expect a different result. I'm saying you're going to be disappointed. You're going to spend a lot of money. And these guys wouldn't want you to spend money and find that anyway, because it would reflect back on them. If you went to them and said, how about I buy your jet and replace the existing jet, and they looked at it, they're going to say, don't do that, because you're going to be mad at me because you're going to find it isn't going to work. You've got to change your whole burner design. And then finally I said, let's not start by just saying, how big is the firebox? Let me divide it in 2 by 2 inch by 2 inch pieces and count up the number of jets, and I'm going to start there, and that's where I'm going to go. I would not do that anymore. I did do that at one time, and I wouldn't do that. I would go through this math, and I'd come up and say, what is going to be the final pressure required at the jet and the BTUs, and how does that compare to the requirement for the locomotive, and where am I with respect to that sweet spot? So I'm going to end it there, because I've taken a little more than the 1 hour we'd originally planned, and just say if there are any general questions or anything, I'd be more than pleased. Ray.
I would just like to point out one thing. I hear a lot of people that are going to design something and say, well, we'd like to keep it to the old barbecue tanks. But one thing you have to remember, with the type of pigtails that you hook up to barbecue tanks, you'll have a black nozzle on it. That's what's required today. In there is a beaker. And if there's a surge, it's only intended to allow a half PSI through there, and it walks up on it. So if you know that, you say, oh, I'll go to the green one. And there's the green ones out there, and they're for a certain amount. And then there's the red ones that are for people like lead burners. So there could be enough flow through there for a lead burner. But still, if you sit there with your tanks and you have your variable, that's set at 12 psi. You turn on the tank, you get a surge all the way up to the locomotive, the BB shut off. I had this problem with reds. So what I did is I went back, you could still buy the old-fashioned. Inside of all of our barbecue tanks is the old-fashioned threads, which are reverse threads. And you can buy the old type that was always used. You don't have to worry about it ever again.
And those are what they call CGA 510 connections, okay? Compressed Gas Association 510. That's standard for all fuel gases out there to do that. So you can use those for them. To tie in what you were saying, Ray, you were talking about the tanks freezing up and the hoses. The hoses are exactly right. I get more questions because I'm like, what kind of hoses are you using? And most of them are that case. They have those check valves in there that restrict the flow, and our systems demand more on that. The thing about the tanks freezing up, the vertical tanks, the barbecue style tanks that people use, they have less evaporative surface area than the horizontal tanks. As your levels of propane decrease in your tanks, you lose that evaporative surface area. Where in a horizontal tank, it doesn't decrease until you're very, very low in the tank. So that's another thing to think about. Making sure you have enough things for that.
Yeah, you mentioned that in the article. There has to be a heat exchange taking place with the propane inside the tank and with the outside air, and you need the surface, which is what he's pointing out, to do that. Question in the back.
Will one of the blankets you can put on one of those, can you use that to keep it from freezing up?
I missed the first part of that. The what?
They have propane blankets so it doesn't freeze and you can plug it into a Jackery or a Luetti.
No, that's actually confusing things. You want heat exchange to take place. The propane, when it evaporates, is going to give up the heat energy that it took to compress it in the first place, and that's what's going to cause it to get cold. And you don't want the propane to get cold, and it has to exchange. It has to get that energy back, and it's got to get it through the wall from the atmosphere. So that's the last thing you want to do. You want to. That's the reason you might put your propane bottle in a tank of water, because you want the exchange to take place. You want the water to take the energy away.
I think she was talking about the electrically heated one.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you were talking about an insulating blanket. A heating blanket is the opposite of an insulating blanket in that case. Yes, okay. I stand corrected. Thank you.
Heating blankets they sell are about 1 watt or maybe 2 watts. They're totally useless. We tried one.
Yeah.
Immersion heaters in a bucket of water work really well when the tanks freeze.
Yeah, good point, Rich. Yeah, if I did the calculation on the energy, you'd discover that. In the back, there's a question.
I will say there's one disadvantage to the heating blanket. If you're not paying attention to your propane levels, you can overheat your tank and cause the safeties to blow and have gas leak and ignite from your fire. I've seen this happen before.
Thank you. Okay, yeah.
Have you ever looked into doing a liquid draw system instead of vapor, so then you reduce the freezing problem and all that entirely? You go to a vaporizer system.
Yeah, liquid draw, I've never considered it, and, my forklift runs on it. I've never looked at it.
There's a lot of disadvantages with the liquid draw systems. One, you have to have the expansion chambers to basically convert the liquid over to that. So you're taking up more space for that. So, and the heat exchange then goes into a vapor bowl also.
Aren't you just moving the problem to a different place?
Excuse me?
Aren't you just moving the problem to a different place?
Yeah, basically.
Yeah, you created a different problem. Philip?
How much difference would there be between natural gas and propane in terms of design of the city?
I didn't hear him. Somebody tell me.
Natural gas and propane design setup differences.
Natural gas and propane. There's a fairly significant difference in the heat value content of those two gases. There is less of a difference between butane and propane. They're both higher energy providers. In order to go to natural gas, you'd have to have a larger orifice. The simple answer would be you've got to get more gas to get the same BTUs. Okay.
Would you also have to get more oxygen through the
You'd have to write the chemical equation, and you would find there would be a difference in the amount of oxygen, but it's not, it's, it, 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 It's related to the amount of the carbon and hydrogen molecules that you have to, or atoms that you have to actually associate with oxygen. So it's a different number, but it's not, you have to write a chemical equation for me to answer the question, so I don't know off the top of my head.
I think so long ago, when you did set that up, with all of the charts that came out of the formulas, there was the two numbers there for, so you always used the propane.
Yeah.
Because the jets all had one for natural gas.
Yeah, you have to use the, so it's a different numeric number, and natural gas has less energy per unit volume. Okay, so you'd have to burn a lot more of it to get the same thing. Means you have to have higher gas flows. Okay, on that note, people are starting to look. Wait a minute, one more here.
Okay, this is a completely stupid question, but when I hadn't done any homework on it, but probably a decade ago when I was doing G-scale stuff and doing live steam at that, I wasn't really doing a lot. I just dabbled with it. I ended up watching a video that took me to England, and these guys were doing ceramic burners. Is there, and I don't know, is there a difference between orifices and ceramic burners?
Heat radiant burners.
I've done a little dabbling in it. Basically, it's a porous ceramic burner. So basically, the burners, I call them the flame tube burners, that look like regular barbecue grill. Chuck Hackett's Northern uses one of these with excellent results. It uses the same orifice type that shoots it into a chamber, and those gases come up through a porous ceramic.
Yeah.
You're increasing, one, you have to get a piece of ceramic big enough. Okay, then you're going to have to basically balance your orifice size for one single orifice to cover that entire area and get the volume to do that. It is possible, but it is platform dependent, just like those flame tube burners are.
Yeah, so you could go to a barbecue style where you have a big mixing tube and just holes, and you don't have the same combining in the individual jets as you have. You can go to impinged jets, which require the first burn to blow at the other burn in order to add mixing. There's some fundamentally major different systems. I've really focused this around the assumption that if we all talk about slotted jets, we're talking about the same thing, and we understand that, and they're common because a lot of the people in the business really understand that. If we want to go beyond that, it's a different discussion, so I think we take it outside this.
Just a quick comment following on this for the G-scale. Usually those are single flue boilers, and for the boilers that were originally designed to use alcohol burners. And so you have a different flame pattern. You don't have gas flowing through the coal bed or the nozzles as we have in the propane burners. You have gas flowing on top of your burner. And so you can go to the ceramic one because you get that gas distribution than the small nozzle and small boiler. But it's a completely different type of boiler that requires a different type of combustion pattern to feed it.
Great. Let me thank all of you for your time and attention. I appreciate it. I can't imagine sitting here and listening to me talk this long. You've been wonderful. I hope it has some value. I hope that some more people can be helped. I'm pleased with a lot of the reports I get back from people that have thanked us for what we've done. And Rich, you have given me some nice kudos. I appreciate it. And so thanks for the time. If anybody gets a benefit from this, then it was certainly worth the effort, and it was my pleasure to come and meet with you today. So thank you.